Hi there, it's good to see you again. We have an interesting lesson today. We hear a lot about the Middle East in the news, and there's so much conflict too. Why is that? Well, that's what we're going to find out today as we look at today's lesson question, how did issues in the Persian Gulf region lead to conflict with the United States? Next, we'll take a look at our lesson goals. Throughout the lesson, we'll be trying to reach these goals, and by the end of the lesson, you should be able to meet all of them. We're going to learn about the international involvement in the Middle East conflict. We're going to describe the causes and the effects of the Gulf War. We're going to explain the events surrounding the formation of al-Qaeda. And we're going to describe what happened on September 11th, 2001 and the U.S. response. But before we get started, let's take a look at our lesson vocabulary. Take a moment to type these important vocabulary words into your e-notes and check your glossary for definitions. Keep your eyes peeled for these vocabulary words as you move through the lesson. And remember, the green words are important words used in all your courses, and the purple words are words related to today's lesson. We have controversial, coalition, terrorism, and weapons of mass destruction. So it looks like we're ready to jump into our lesson. In this lesson, we're going to answer our lesson question, how did issues in the Persian Gulf region lead to conflict with the United States? But before we get started, let's learn more about the Persian Gulf. When we talk about the Persian Gulf region, we're really talking about the Middle Eastern countries collected around the Persian Gulf itself. And these countries include Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Iraq, Iran, United Arab Emirates, and Oman. The Persian Gulf is an area of the Middle East that includes countries on the Arabian Peninsula, along the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea. It is a culturally diverse region that is home to many ethnic groups, including Arabs, Persians, Pashtun, Azerbaijanis, Kurds and Turks, and Islam, both Sunni and Shia, is the dominant religion. In this lesson, we'll be answering the lesson question, how did issues in the Persian Gulf region lead to conflict with the United States? We'll be looking at the Persian Gulf War, formation of al-Qaeda, and 9/11 and the U.S. response. Now, let's take a look at the events of the Persian Gulf War and how they set the stage for what was to come. Saddam Hussein ruled Iraq from 1979 to 2003. He was a powerful leader who waged war with other Middle Eastern nations. He ruled as a dictator. He used a secret police force and terrorism to stay in power. While Iraq's leader Hussein's goal was to gain complete control of the oil-rich Persian Gulf area, at one point he unsuccessfully attempted to conquer Iran and take control of its resources. He ordered the invasion of Iran in 1980, escalating existing conflicts into an 8-year war. The previous year, Iran's Ayatollah Khomeini had called on Iraqis to overthrow Hussein's Ba'ath government. As president, he became known for human rights abuses, including torture and genocide. In 1988, he attempted to annihilate the Kurdish race through military operations that killed at least 50,000 civilians and destroyed thousands of villages. He was eventually overthrown, convicted of war crimes, and executed. Hussein rose from obscurity to become the president of Iraq and ruled the nation as a dictator. In 1990, the Iraqi army invaded the small country of Kuwait. Saddam Hussein ordered the invasion in order to gain control of the country's large oil reserves. Kuwait had a significant oil supply, and oil was one of Iraq's most lucrative exports. Kuwait also had an excellent seaport, and Iraq's access was limited. He also wanted to eliminate Iraq's debt to Kuwait and to demonstrate Iraq's strength to other nations. Saudi Arabia is the world's largest producer of oil and worried they might be next. Here's the border between them. So the big idea here is this turn of events worried many countries around the world which depended on this area for its supply of oil. The UN Security Council demanded that Hussein leave Kuwait. The United Nations, through a US-backed resolution, gave Hussein a deadline for leaving Kuwait. As that date neared, NATO troops gathered in Saudi Arabia ready to strike. In an attempt to avoid an armed conflict, the United Nations gave Iraq a date to withdraw from Kuwait. When the UN deadline was ignored, Allied forces invaded. The coalition was led by the United States, and it included NATO and Arab forces from several countries, including Egypt, Qatar, and Syria, as well as Kuwaiti forces. Conflict in the Middle East involved nations from around the world. The combined resources of the coalition added up to a powerful force. Why did the U.S. get involved in a war overseas? International coalition forces intervened in the Persian Gulf at the request of Saudi Arabia and Egypt to liberate Kuwait from Iraqi occupation. As President Bush explained, Kuwait was a small nation and not considered powerful from a military perspective. Iraq was the aggressor. To protect oil reserves and stabilize oil prices. We also know that Arab nations wanted the U.S. UN involved. They were concerned for themselves and their oil reserves. The war demonstrated U.S. military and technological strength. Operation Desert Storm was the name of the UN offensive in Kuwait. In January 1991, the United States led a bombing campaign in Iraq. Ground invasion was launched 6 weeks later. Retreating Iraqi soldiers set fire to oil wells in Kuwait. This was a disaster and caused economic and environmental devastation in the region. Iraq was forced to accept the United Nations ceasefire terms. The UN forces did not invade Iraq. They just removed Iraqi forces from Kuwait. World leaders expected Hussein's regime to topple, but it didn't. The conflict officially ended February 28, 1991, with an Iraqi withdrawal and a NATO ceasefire. Hussein agreed to the terms of the ceasefire: recognition of Kuwait's right to exist independently, elimination of long-range missiles and weapons of mass destruction in Iraq's possession, cooperation with UN weapons inspectors, including allowing them to visit Iraq. As part of the ceasefire, Iraq had to give up any long-range or especially dangerous weapons and had to allow UN inspectors to make certain that it complied with the terms. Hussein was forbidden from possessing weapons of mass destruction, large-scale weaponry, especially chemical, biological, radiological, or nuclear weapons, and establishment of U.S.-led UN force in Saudi Arabia to protect Kuwait from further attack. After Iraq's defeat, the world community took steps to ensure that Iraq would no longer be a threat to the Middle Eastern peace. Despite the events of the war, Hussein did not curb his ruthless methods after his defeat in Kuwait. The Kurds, for instance, were an ethnic group that lived in the northern part of the country. The Shiites were an Islamic sect that lived in the southern part of the country. Both groups rebelled against Hussein's rule. Hussein cracked down on them using chemical weapons against the rebels, such as mustard gas, to suppress their rebellion. When Hussein refused to admit UN weapons inspectors, as required by the ceasefire, the United Nations imposed sanctions against Iraq for Hussein's unwillingness to cooperate. The United Nations restricted trade with Iraq, including how much oil it could sell, in an effort to convince Hussein to cooperate with inspectors. It didn't work. We're still trying to answer our lesson question: how did issues in the Persian Gulf region lead to conflict with the United States? You just saw the events leading up to the Persian Gulf War and its aftermath in Iraq. At the same time this war was going on, a group known as the Taliban rose to power in Afghanistan. The Taliban rose to power by restoring order in Afghanistan after the country's 9-year war with the Soviet Union. The 9-year Soviet war in Afghanistan had left the country in disarray, with a weak government and a troubled society. By the mid-1990s, the Taliban had arisen and restored a degree of order. The strict Islamist regime governed Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001. The Taliban imposed a strict Islamist form of government in which all laws were based on its own interpretation of the Quran. Women were particularly oppressed under the Taliban. The Taliban also allowed terrorist organizations to operate out of Afghanistan, including one in particular known as al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda is a loose network of Islamic extremists created by Osama bin Laden. Al-Qaeda is a militant Islamist group that was founded in the late 1980s. The organization began as a support network to fight the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. It opposes a Western involvement in Middle Eastern affairs, and it opposes what it considers to be false Islamic regimes. These terrorists are just a small part of the Islamic population. It is not typical for a Muslim to be a terrorist. After the Gulf War, al-Qaeda shifted its focus from the Soviet Union to the United States. It demanded the United States withdraw its troops from Saudi Arabia. When the United States refused, al-Qaeda declared war on America and subsequently committed numerous acts of terrorism. It has been designated a terrorist organization by the UN Security Council, the European Union, NATO, and the US government. Osama bin Laden was a member of a wealthy Saudi Arabian family founded the al-Qaeda network. He united Islamic fighters he met in Afghanistan to create al-Qaeda. He viewed the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan as an attack on Islam. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, bin Laden viewed their actions as an assault on his religion. He traveled to Afghanistan to fight them. He saw the U.S.-led forces in the Persian Gulf as another attack on Islam. And he supported and bankrolled attacks on the U.S. in 2001. During the Soviet war, bin Laden kept a computerized list of the Islamic fighters he met. This list eventually would become the group known as al-Qaeda. After the war, he returned home to Saudi Arabia, but the government expelled him for his radical views. He eventually returned to Afghanistan, which would remain his base for many years. Now, let's do a quick review of what you've learned so far. Al-Qaeda began attacks against the United States in the late 1990s. Al-Qaeda terrorists bombed 2 U.S. embassies in Africa, one in Kenya and one in Tanzania. As a result of bin Laden's involvement in the bombings, the FBI placed him on its top 10 most wanted list in 1999. The United States also bombed bin Laden's suspected bases in Afghanistan. In 2000, al-Qaeda bombers attacked the USS Cole, an American naval ship, while it was refueling in the Middle Eastern country of Yemen. The suspected organizer of the attack has been held at the U.S. base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, since 2006. Al-Qaeda's next act would change the United States and the world. We're well on our way to answering our lesson question: how did issues in the Persian Gulf region lead to conflict with the United States? Keep up the good work here. There's a lot going on in this lesson. We've seen how the Persian Gulf War and the rise of al-Qaeda has increased tensions between the United States and the Middle East. Now we'll take a look at the attacks on September 11, 2001, and how they changed the way the United States dealt with international terrorism. On the morning of September 11, 2001, hijackers took over 4 flights. These 4 planes would not reach their destinations. Instead, they would crash into different places. 2 of the planes were piloted into the Twin Towers at the World Trade Center in New York City. 1 plane was flown into the Pentagon, and 1 plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. I can remember this very clearly. My husband had just left for work. He only got to the end of our street when he heard the news on the radio, turned around, came back home, and we watched it on TV. I still get chills remembering it. Close to 3,000 people died. After the September 11th attacks, the FBI identified 19 hijackers and linked them to the terrorist organization al-Qaeda. Bin Laden later claimed responsibility for the attacks, citing the presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, American support of Israel, and sanctions against Iraq as reasons. The United States demanded that Afghanistan's Taliban government turn over Osama bin Laden. U.S. President George W. Bush, the son of former President George H.W. Bush, who was president during the Persian Gulf War, soon demanded that Afghanistan turn over Osama bin Laden. When the Taliban refused, NATO forces mobilized for an invasion. President Bush launched the War on Terror in the wake of the 9/11 attacks. This action showed that the United States was still willing to get involved in conflict in the Middle East to protect Americans at home. The U.S. mobilized for war. The response to the 9/11 terrorist attacks did not involve only the United States. Other nations took notice and contributed their own forces to combat terrorism. In October 2001, the United States began bombing Taliban defenses. The Taliban were driven from power and a new government was established. Many countries contributed to the war effort, including Great Britain, Australia, Germany, and Pakistan. Pakistan's contribution caused deep divisions within the Pakistani government. And in 2011, after a 10-year manhunt, bin Laden was killed by U.S. forces in Pakistan. In 2003, the United States invaded Iraq with officials saying the nation posed a threat to U.S. security. This invasion was very controversial. The U.S. claimed that Iraq had possessions of weapons of mass destruction. Many nations who supported the efforts in Afghanistan did not agree with the decision to invade Iraq. Many Americans disagreed as well. The United States never found the weapons they believed Hussein had developed, but the dictator himself was eventually captured, tried, and executed for war crimes by the new Iraqi government. And free elections were held in 2005. In addition to the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, the U.S. established reforms to limit the changes of another 9/11. The 9/11 attacks brought about a massive examination of how the U.S. government responded to the threat of international terrorism. It also led to a series of actions intended to make the country safer. It established the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Homeland Security was created to protect the country against terrorist attacks. It increased security at airports, airplanes, and border crossings. And that's been followed by civilian organizations as well. For example, increased security and bag checks at sporting events and concerts or other types of entertainment that draws large crowds. And it passed the USA Patriot Act to expand government authority to investigate suspected terrorists, and also to investigate the activities and communications and financial transactions of those suspected terrorist ties. This act is also controversial, and opponents wonder about privacy infringement on those who are not terrorists. So, your big idea here is that the 9/11 attacks resulted in measures to increase security at home and to eliminate threats to the United States from abroad. Now, let's take a moment to review some key words from the lesson.
This timeline right here does a really great job of showing conflict in the Middle East, and you can see one of the key drivers to that conflict was Saddam Hussein rising to power in 1979. And 1 year later, you see the 8-year Iran-Iraq War. In 1991, the Persian Gulf War begins. From 1996 to 2001, the Taliban ruled Afghanistan, and using Afghanistan as a base, the Taliban attacked the United States on September 11th, 2001. And this attack led to the U.S. invading Afghanistan to remove the Taliban from power. A couple years later, you see the U.S. war in Iraq from 2003 to 2011. And going back to Afghanistan, you see Osama bin Laden is killed in the neighboring Pakistan. The big idea here is that you can see the conflict in the Middle East. But moving to sort of a grander scale is that you can see that the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1979. Again, Saddam Hussein took power in Iraq. But what I want to point out is in 1989, the Cold War ends. So you see a shift in U.S. foreign policy away from communism. However, as we can see in 2001, we can see that the shift away from communism, but foreign policy came around to having a more pinpoint look and a more pinpoint ideas they wanted to focus on, terrorism.